spy Mark Rich, whom Clinton pardoned in his last days as president. Libby was recently found guilty of lying to federal investigators in the Valerie Plame affair, in which Plame, a covert CIA agent, was exposed for political revenge by the Bush administration following her husband's revelations about the lies leading to the Iraq War. Robert Satloff, U.S. National Security Council advisor, Satloff was the executive director of the Israeli lobby's think tank, Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Many of the Israeli lobby's experts come from this front group, like Martin Indyk. Elliot Abrams, National Security Council advisor, he previously worked at Washington-based think tank Ethics and Public Policy Center. During the Reagan administration, Abrams was the Assistant Secretary of State, handling, for the most part, Latin American affairs, played an important role in the Iran-Contra scandal, which involved illegally selling U.S. weapons to Iran to fight Iraq, and illegally funding the Contra rebels fighting to overthrow Nicaragua's Sandinista government. He also actively deceived 3 congressional committees about his involvement and thereby faced felony charges based on his testimony. Abrams pled guilty in 1991 to 2 misdemeanors and was sentenced to a year's probation and 100 hours of community service. A year later, former President Bush, Sr., granted Abrams a full pardon. He was one of the more hawkish pro-Israel Jews in the Reagan administration's State Department. Mark Grossman, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. He was Director General of the Foreign Service and Director of Human Resources at the Department of State. Grossman is one of many of the pro-Israel Jewish officials from the Clinton administration that Bush has promoted to higher posts. Richard Haass, Director of Policy Planning at the State Department and Ambassador at Large. He is also Director of National Security Programs and Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR. He was one of the more hawkish pro-Israel Jews in the first Bush Sr. administration who sat on the National Security Council and who consistently advocated going to war against Iraq. Haass is also a member of the Defense Department's National Security Study Group at the Pentagon. Robert Zoellick, U.S. Trade Representative, a cabinet-level position. He is also one of the more hawkish pro-Israel Jews in the Bush Jr. administration who advocated invading Iraq and occupying a portion of the country in order to set up a Vichy-style puppet government. He consistently advocates going to war against Iran. Ari Fleischer, ex-White House spokesman for the Bush Jr. administration. Prominent in the Jewish community, some reports state that he holds Israeli citizenship. Fleischer is closely connected to the extremist Jewish group called the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidics, who follow the Kabbalah and hold very extremist and insulting views on non-Jews. Fleischer was the co-president of Chabad's Capital Jewish Forum. He received the Young Leadership Award from the American Friends of Lubavitch in October 2001. James Schlesinger, one of the many Pentagon advisors, Schlesinger also sits on the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board under Pearl and is another extremist pro-Israel advisor who supported going to war against Iraq. Schlesinger is also a commissioner of the Defense Department's National Security Study Group at the Pentagon. David Frum, White House speechwriter behind the Axis of Evil label, he lumped together all the lies and accusations against Iraq for Bush to justify the war. Joshua Bolten, White House Deputy Chief of Staff. Bolten was previously a banker, former legislative aide, and prominent in the Jewish community. John Bolton, former UN representative and Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Bolton is also a senior advisor to President Bush. Prior to this position, Bolton was senior vice president of the above-mentioned pro-Israel think tank, AEI. He recently, October 2002, accused Syria of having a nuclear program so that they can attack Syria after Iraq or Iran. He must have forgotten that Israel has several hundred nuclear warheads, some of which are thermonuclear weapons, according to recent intelligence from the United States Air Force. David Wormser, Special Assistant to John Bolton, the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. Wormser also worked at the AEI with Pearl and Bolton. His wife, Merav Wormser, along with Colonel Yigal Karman, formerly of Israeli Military Intelligence, co-founded the Middle East Media Research Institute, or MIMRI, a Washington-based Israeli outfit which distributes articles translated from Arabic newspapers portraying Arabs in a bad light. Elliot Cohen, member of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board under Pearl, and is another extremist pro-Israel advisor. Like Edelman, he often expresses extremist and often ridiculous anti-Arab and anti-Muslim views. More recently, he wrote an opinion article in the Wall Street Journal openly admitting his racist hatred of Islam, claiming that Islam should be the enemy, not terrorism.
Look, sometimes the word neoconservative is used when what they really would like to say is Jew. They being people who use that kind of language. And as a Jew, I find it offensive. There are two things that are despicable about it. The first is the imputation of dual loyalties. What they really would like to say is Jew.
Mel Sembler, president of the Export-Import Bank of the United States, a prominent Jewish Republican and former national finance chairman of the Republican National Committee. The Export-Import Bank facilitates trade relationships between U.S. businesses and foreign countries, specifically those with financial problems. Steve Goldsmith, senior advisor to the president and Bush's Jewish domestic policy advisor. He also served as liaison in the White House office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, White House OFBCI, within the Executive Office of the President. He was the former mayor of Indianapolis. He is also friends with Israeli Jerusalem Mayor Ehud Olmert and often visits Israel to coach mayors on privatization initiatives. A number of other dual Israeli citizens serving in our government are Adam Goldman, White House's special liaison to the Jewish community, Joseph Gildenhorn, Bush campaign's special liaison to the Jewish community. He was the D.C. finance chairman for the Bush campaign, as well as campaign coordinator and former ambassador to Switzerland. Christopher Gersten, principal deputy assistant secretary, administration for children and families at HHS. Gersten was the former executive director of the Republican Jewish Coalition, husband of labor secretary. Mark Weinberger, assistant secretary of housing and urban development for public affairs. Samuel Bodman, Deputy Secretary of Commerce. He was the chairman and CEO of Cabot Corporation in Boston, Massachusetts. Bonnie Cohen, Undersecretary of State for Management. Ruth Davis, Director of Foreign Service Institute, who reports to the Office of Undersecretary for Management. This office is responsible for training all Department of State staff, including ambassadors. Daniel Kurtzer, Ambassador to Israel. Cliff Sobel, Ambassador to the Netherlands. Stuart Bernstein, Ambassador to Denmark. Nancy Brinker, Ambassador to Hungary. Frank Lavin, Ambassador to Singapore. Ron Weiser, Ambassador to Slovakia. Mel Sebler, Ambassador to Italy, mentioned earlier. Martin Silverstein, Ambassador to Uruguay. Lincoln Bloomfield, Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. Jay Lefkowitz, Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of the Domestic Policy Council. Ken Millman, White House Political Director, and Brad Blakeman, White House Director of Scheduling.
Michael Chertoff is now the Director of Homeland Security. Prior to his appointment as Director, he oversaw the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice till July of 2001. He is the man behind the investigation of 9/11, or lack of investigation, as it were. Chertoff was the U.S. prosecuting attorney for the District of New Jersey. Michael Chertoff is the person who had control of the evidence and prosecution of the first bombing of the World Trade Center. Chertoff's father is a man by the name of Gershon Baruch Chertoff, who happens to be a Talmudic rabbi. Michael Chertoff's uncle Mordecai is also a rabbi. Michael's grandfather was a very well-known teacher of the Talmud in New York City. Chertoff's sister was the head of Hadassah, the women's branch of the Zionist Organization of America. She went to a Hebrew university before Israel was even a state. The Chertoff family was one of the founding families of the State of Israel. Michael Chertoff's aunt works with the Zionist movement in London, Chicago, and New York City. Chertoff's power over domestic security